Everybody, dear Daron, dear guests, you can't imagine how proud I am to welcome you to Basel today. The President of the Government, Konradin Kramer, is here, and the Minister of Education and Research was here during lunch. He had to leave, but he was at least involved in some conversations. Many important exponents of our largest companies are sitting here, and of course, several professors and students. Welcome to everybody. The interest in your presentation, Daron, is incredible. The rare tickets for this lecture were gone almost as quickly as those for a Taylor Swift concert. It is not easy to pay tribute to an economist who has just received the most important science prize in Stockholm. But I try, and I would like to highlight your incredible foresight. Back in 2001, you described the causal evidence for the role of institutions in economic development in an article in the American Economy Review. And in 2012, your bestseller, Why Nations Fail, was published. At the time, you probably didn't think that your core thesis on the origins of power, prosperity, and poverty would now, some 25 years later, be more relevant than ever. Dear Daron, today you are speaking in a rich city, in one of the richest countries in the world, in a country that has created a great deal of wealth over the past decades and centuries. We all know that we are privileged to live here and now, but we also know that this prosperity is not God-given. We too have to stand up for our institutions, including the university as an educational one. Dear Daron, thank you for your incredible and inspiring contribution to make this world a better place. Before I give you the floor, I would like to let Mr. Andreas Sivi say a few words. Together with his Democracy Foundation Basel, we are able to hold this event today, and I would like to thank him most sincerely for that. Please, Mr. Sivi.
Dear Daron, dear guests, on behalf of the Democracy Foundation Basel, I'd like to join Andrea in welcoming you all to Daron's keynote speech today. We are grateful to the university for co-organizing this event with us and for Daron to have accepted at relatively short notice the invitation to come to Basel and explain his ideas to us. One of the tasks our foundation has set itself is to promote the exchange of ideas between academia and civil society. Imagine my surprise when I found Daron's latest book, Power and Progress, for a grand total of 7.99 francs on Amazon. Imagine my next surprise when I found at the end of the book a 10-page summary written by Daron himself, explaining all the theories developed within and all the research work on which they are based. If you're short of time, you must not read the whole book. Of course, that would be a great pity, because the book, like Daron's famous Why Nations Fail, is a great pleasure to read and written in a style accessible to everyone. Not only is Daron a perfect example of a scholar who reaches out to a large public, his research and findings go to the very core of our democracies. In Why Nations Fail, he has shown convincingly that only countries with strong democratic institutions succeed over the long term. This remains an essential insight at a time when democracy is being challenged and questioned from all sides. And in Power and Progress, he has again had the courage to challenge a key assumption of our political economy, namely that new technologies tend to benefit the society at large. Unfortunately, the contrary can be true, and new technologies such as unregulated social media are profoundly destabilizing our societies. I'm very excited to hear these ideas elaborated in more detail by Daron. Daron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much, Andreas. It's a true pleasure to be here, and wonderful to have all of you. It's my second time in Basel. It's a wonderful city, and it's my privilege to be able to talk to you at the University of Basel in this very nice room. And what I'm going to talk about is actually a little more sort of backward-looking. We can come to some of the issues that you raised, Andreas, and towards the end. I'm going to talk more about sort of the work that I did and how the two parts of my work, the one on institutions and the one on technology, meet, which is essentially the story of power and progress as well. But I'm going to tell the sort of the backstory to that. So this lecture is actually based not on my book, which I would have been very happy to talk about as well, but it's actually based on my Nobel lecture. So the starting point for me is actually what drew me to economics in the first place. And I'll just turn this here like this so that I know which slide I'm talking about. Which is the very large differences in prosperity around the world. There are many ways of visualizing that, and this one is just a heat map of the world, and you have countries shaded according to their income per capita. Those in the darkest blue, such as Switzerland, United States, Germany, are about 65 times as rich as the bottom 10% of the countries, which are shown in white. In our hyper-connected, globalized world, it is really mind-boggling how such huge differences in prosperity can exist. From the beginning, actually, when I was in high school, like you guys, I was interested in these questions, and my ideas were not very articulated at the time, but I think I was drawn to what we now call institutions, meaning the organization of society, the rules of the game, property rights, laws, regulations, political arrangements that influence who has power, how that power is exercised, how level the playing field is, and all of the supporting institutions such as universities, media, and so on. Institutions are sharply different across societies, as we also observe. And if you look at the relationship between institutions and prosperity, you see a big association. So I'm showing you that on the left here, only some of the countries, some of them that you know, are marked, and I'll explain why they are marked here. I'm using an index, whichever index of institutions you use, doesn't matter. This one is from the World Bank's rule of law, how well laws are enforced and how equally if they're enforced across people and how much they respect civil rights, human rights, etc. And if you look at the relationship between that and GDP per capita, it's very strong, both in terms of explaining quite a bit of the variation and being very robust. And for future reference, I'm showing you a couple of countries there, and those I'll come back to later, but at the bottom, you see about 5-6 countries I've marked. At the top, I've marked another few countries. Those are all former European colonies, and I'll talk about the former European colonies in a second, but you can see already from this scatter plot that they are both at the top and the bottom and all throughout the distribution. The problem with institutions is that they are, of course, human constructs. We imagine and we form and we enforce them ourselves. So they are highly endogenous. What that means is if we really think they are important, it gives us hope that we can have better institutions for more equitable distribution of resources, better productivity, better economic growth, better prosperity. But from a statistical point of view, it also means that the association that I just showed you cannot be interpreted as causal. It could well be that it is rich countries who can afford better institutions, so it's the causality goes reverse. Or it could be that some other factors are in the background and they explain both institutional variation and income per capita. In fact, such ideas have been expressed by philosophers and thinkers for as long as we know, and one of the early ones was the very important French political philosopher Montesquieu, who not only articulated the modern theory of separation of powers, but he also argued that there were very big differences in terms of mentality, ability, and so on across people that lived in different climates. And he said, you know, people in warm climates are going to be lazy, and they're not going to have curiosity, so they're going to be poor. But he also went on to add that his theory of separation of powers was not for these people in hot climates. It was only for the more temperate climates. So in his explanation, therefore, you would see the kind of association that I'm showing you, but it's caused by what economists or statisticians would call an omitted factor, the underlying, say, climatic conditions or other conditions that influence both institutions and prosperity. So to really make progress both theoretically and empirically in terms of an understanding of what institutions do, how they influence prosperity, what channels via which they influence it, and how they evolve over time, we need much more of a theoretical framework, which is what I have tried over the years to do. And one of the places where myself and my collaborators, in particular Simon Johnson and James Robinson, have looked at is into the European colonial history. The reason for that is at least twofold. One, European colonial expansion is one of the most defining events of the last 500 years. So the world's history cannot be understood without recognizing the far-reaching implications of colonial history, which at some point covered 2/3 of the world. But secondly, we also know that these colonial experiences shaped institutions, and they shaped them in very different ways. And that's the reason why in the slide here, I was showing you that some of the colonies are at the very, very bottom of the institutional rule of law. They have the worst laws, worst enforcement of laws, most unequally enforced. And they have some of the, at least according to these indices, the best enforced laws. So at least as a lab to understand how institutions form and how they evolve, European colonial history is not a bad place to start. But we need a theory. In fact, we need a multifaceted theory. And this is what my work has tried to do, which is to develop both a theoretical framework for thinking about how institutions form, how they persist, and where the source of variation that could be useful for cutting through the Gordian knot of the endogeneity of institutions may come from. So I'll try to summarize some of the main theoretical ideas in 2 charts. So schematically, this first one shows an overarching sort of interpretation of institutional change, institutional persistence, and their effects on institutions. In the parlance of economics, we would say that political institutions and the distribution of resources, for example, who has wealth, who owns the assets, who owns the land, who owns the factories, who controls information today, are state variables, meaning they change slowly. And then at a given point in time, which the subscript T there indicates, they influence various things. One of the most important things that they influence is who holds political power. In particular, they influence both what we call de jure political power, which means political power is allocated by institutions. For example, institutions might say there's a monarch like in Saudi Arabia and he decides everything. That's a de jure fact. Or institutions might say every one person, one vote. But in practice, of course, things work differently. There might be one person, one vote, but the owner of the richest people in the world, the owner of the largest corporations may on the side influence politics. That we think is related to, of course, to the institutions as they are articulated, but it's very much related to how they work in practice, and we talk about that as de facto political power. So the distribution of resources and institutions today influence de jure and de facto political power, and de jure and de facto political power are the arbiters of what sort of decisions get made. And there are many decisions, many of them are important, but let me here focus on two. One of them is that whoever holds political power, if they have enough of it, they can even change institutions. We can rewrite constitutions, or we can change the way laws are enforced, or dictatorships can transition to democracy, or the reverse. And they also influence how economic institutions function, and via that they impact economic performance. So that's part of the prosperity that we're talking about. And also who gains, who loses, the distribution of resources, which then transmit together with the political institutions' choices of today, political institutions T+1, and the distribution of resources to T+1, so that this sort of continues. The reason why I am presenting this is because it highlights the multiple channels via which institutions affect the current equilibrium, and via that the thing that we care about, something like GDP, gross domestic product per capita. But it also indicates that within this framework there are both forces towards persistence, meaning that once a particular set of political institutions are in place, they will tend to replicate themselves, because those people who benefit from those institutions become more empowered politically, and they also control more assets and distributions. But also there are forces here for change in political institutions. Things are not God-given. They are determined, and sometimes shocks or different balances, different coalitions will be a source of political change, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. Now, this framework, of course, is our guiding starting point, but the way in which we apply this to the colonial era is where the real test of whether we can overcome these endogeneity concerns that I talked about begins, and that I'm summarizing here via this other second schema. And here what we are interested in is that last link, which I have denoted D, the relationship between current institutions and current performance. And that's the one that I showed you in a correlational way in an earlier graph, and I said endogeneity of institutions makes that very difficult to interpret. So the idea here is to use the colonial episode and the specific sources of institutional divergence during the colonial era in order to overcome this problem. This is what economists would refer to, or statisticians would refer to, as an instrumental variable strategy, meaning that you use not all of the variation, but only some part of the variation that is based on some arguably credible theory. And here is the theory. Current institutions are very much a function of past institutions. That's the persistence point that I made earlier on. So current institutions bear the hallmarks of the colonial era institutions. You cannot understand Brazil's institutions today without going back to slavery and Portuguese dominance over Brazil. In the same way, much of Latin America is shaped by the heritage of Spanish colonial era institutions. But where do these institutions come from? So one particular idea that Simon Johnson, James Robinson, and I have put on the table is that there was a divergence across the colonial world between colonies where there were a lot of Europeans who settled, and as a result, the institutions were developed as a result of a more balanced conflict between them and the colonial authorities. When the colonial authorities tried to set up very extractive institutions, our word for things that extract resources, steal, or violate their property rights, or don't give them any opportunities, European settlers, whether they were indentured servants or from other sources, fought back, and as a result they got concessions, both economic and political. This contrasts with the situation in many other parts of the colonial world where very few Europeans settled. Europeans were just the upper strata running the colonies on behalf of the crown or some other company. and the lower strata of society were the natives, the indigenous populations, and they had no opportunity to engage in the same kind of resistance. On the contrary, the colonial economic strategies were very much based on exploiting that indigenous population, so the extractive institutions were much more likely to develop. But where Europeans went, so therefore where there were many settlers, was itself potentially endogenous. So then we went one more step back, and that's the link that I denote as A there, which is that based on historical records and our own reading of the epidemiological understanding at the time, we argued that there were many important diseases, gastrointestinal diseases, but even more importantly, malaria and yellow fever, which were endemic in several parts of the world, and Europeans had no immunity to. So in certain parts of the world, Africa, parts of Latin America, parts of Asia, the conditions, given the scientific understanding, medical understanding at the time, were extremely unfavorable for Europeans to go and settle. On the contrary, to certain other parts, for example, Australia and New Zealand, were much healthier than Europe. So if Europeans at the end decided to go there, they would extend their lives on average. So that created a very different incentives for mass settlements of people of European descent in different parts of the world. And so that's the theory that I and my collaborators exploited in order to sort of try to get closer to estimating the causal effect of institutions. So potential settler mortality, potential because in some parts really no settlers went there. There were just some soldiers, and we could measure their mortality from soldiers in stationary conditions, but in some other parts settlements were quite common. So those settlements determined incentives for different types of institutions to develop, and those institutions to some degree persisted and then enable us to estimate this link D. So let me show you the data, which is quite interesting. So on the horizontal axis, I have the potential settler mortality in logarithms. So the numbers here indicate that in some sense, in some places, Europeans faced over 50% death rate within 1 year, because the conditions, especially when there were epidemics, were so unhealthy that it was just completely impossible for Europeans to go and settle. And this information was very widely distributed, very widely discussed in the European press. On the vertical axis, I have the rule of law index from the World Bank that I showed you earlier on in the correlation, and you see a very remarkable correlation. So about 40% of the variation in institutions today is in the former colonies sample. So in this sample, there are only countries that were European colonies. About 40% of that variation is explained, is associated with these early colonial conditions. And so the instrumental variable strategy is to use this variation, not the 100% of the variation in the rule of law, but this 40% in order to estimate that causal effect. And you can see that causal effect in a different way by looking at what is sometimes called the reduced form, meaning now I'm looking at the relationship between the same horizontal axis, the settler mortality, potential settler mortality, and now on the vertical axis is the variable I'm trying to explain, GDP per capita today in purchasing power parity, so that it's more comparable across countries, and then again I take logarithms of both variables. So you see that there is a very strong association between these colonial conditions 100, 200, 300 years ago and today's prosperity. So the assumption of the instrumental variable strategy, the approach that we developed, was to say, once you control for other things that may matter, this relationship is actually coming through the impact of settler mortality working through institutions. That's sometimes what's called the exclusion restriction. And the outcome of that is shown in this figure. Now I'm showing you again the relationship between the rule of law index and the GDP per capita, but differently from the earlier picture. This is for the former colonies sample, but more importantly, it's not just the raw correlation as I showed you earlier on, but it's the causal effect of institutions estimated through that procedure that I described in words. So the line, this red dark line, is that estimated effect. And you see that it's actually a pretty good fit to the data, which is the sense in which the causal effect here is quite important in explaining the data. It accounts perhaps as much as the 50% of the variation. Now, this is about long-run effects of institutions, which I'm going to come back to, but ever since the beginning of my work in economics, as Andreas already mentioned, I've also been drawn to understanding technology, what determines technology, what its effects are, how its direction works, and I'm going to come back to that topic. But just to tie the two, it is also true that one of the major channels via which colonial era institutions persisted and impacted today's prosperity is via technologies. Countries that have bad institutions typically produce less efficiently and using less of the advanced technologies. So to show you that, I'm now depicting the two-stage least squares or instrumental variable estimates, the causal estimates, but now on the left-hand side, instead of GDP per capita, I have two measures of technology. One is what economists call total factor productivity, which means the part of GDP per capita that's not explained by labor, education, or physical capital investment in machinery. It's what's left as the residual. How efficiently you produce given your factors of production, and how much of a good job are you doing in using technology. So TFP is the most common measure that economists use for trying to understand these things, but it's a bit of a black box because it's computed as a residual. On the right, I use another measure based on the classifications that other people have developed on what are advanced technologies, and I look at what's the fraction of products that are associated with advanced technologies in your exports. And you see an even stronger relationship that countries that have better institutions, again through this causal channel, are the ones that are exporting things like aerospace, computers, digital, electric vehicles, etc. So there is, again, something that suggests that technology is a bit of an important channel here. And so what I'm going to do in the rest of this talk is I'm going to develop a framework for thinking about the joint determination of institutions and technology, and use that framework to tell you a little more about both how institutions work, when they persist, when they change, the mechanisms for it, and then also bring that all the way to the present and think about the institutional pathways that affect technology choices in the age of AI. So the heart of this framework is going to be what I call Utility Technology Possibilities Frontier, UTPF. What it does is that it says, once we take into account both changes in technology and changes in other institutional features given technology, what are the feasible distributional profiles that we can have in society? So for instance, in the simplest case, imagine we have a society that consists of two groups, poor and rich. So the rich could be the landowners, for example, or they could be colonialists in the context of the colonial history that I was talking about. The poor could be peasants, or they could be the native population in the colonies. So I put the utility or the net income level or something related to their prosperity of one group on the horizontal axis, here the poor on the horizontal axis and the rich on the vertical axis. And the utility possibilities frontier traces what different combinations are possible. So let's focus on this downward sloping part. That's the most relevant part. The downward sloping part says, well, we can have an allocation like this. Well, actually, let me go here. We can have an allocation like this, B, which is favorable for poor agents, or we can have one like A, which is much more favorable to rich agents. So why would we have an allocation like B? Well, one important reason for it would be the distribution of power in society. For example, if we think of the poor as workers, and one of the institutions we can have are unions. If unions are strong and they bargain for high wages, then profits are going to be lower, wages are going to be higher. That's going to take us to a point like B. But then you can have institutional change. For example, unions can be defeated or they may become weaker for whatever reasons. And that would move us along the frontier to a point like A, where wages are lower, profits are higher, so therefore we have higher utility for rich agents and lower utility for poor agents. But crucially, what I am interested in is not just how power changes our position along a frontier, but various institutional features and technology, how they shift the frontier. So instead of the moves along the frontier, you can also have things, and I'll talk about them in the next slide, that shift the frontier. So for example, you go from the blue frontier to the red frontier, and you can see that's actually not a good thing, because the red frontier is much lower, which means that you can get much less income, much less utility for both groups, or if I hold one group's level fixed, the other group is going to suffer a lot. But of course, again, institutions and power relations are going to be key in determining what position on that frontier you are. So the way that I have drawn it, for example, just to get your thinking going on this, is that I have drawn this point C on the frontier. So the red frontier is bad, but if you go from point B to point C, it's actually good for rich agents. So bad for society doesn't necessarily mean bad for the rich agents, especially if rich agents are the political elite, meaning that they have disproportionate political force. They may actually favor being on the red frontier with point C rather than point B on the blue frontier. So therefore, that brings me to the situation, to one of the key things I want to discuss, which is what determines your position on the frontier and what determines the shifts of the frontier. So let me start from the shifts. There are 5 channels via which institutions shift the frontier that I have discussed in my work, some of it in the past, some of it more recently. One of them is hold-up, which is the name that economists give to a situation where power is too much concentrated in the hands of one group. So, for example, if you are in the medieval period and lords have so much power that they can actually grab what you produce, or they can force you to work inefficiently, that's a hold-up situation. Those kinds of hold-ups are going to reduce the inefficiency because they distort very strongly the incentives of the non-elite agents in the economy. Another possibility via which institutions shift the frontier is via conflict. So if bad institutions are in place, especially if they are extractive and everybody wants to do the extraction, then what you're going to have is that you're going to have a lot of infighting, and that infighting leads to civil war or collapse of state capacity. And we have seen a lot of that, for example, in the non-ending civil wars in parts of Africa and Asia, with very dire economic consequences. Another important thing, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, but I'll plant for future thinking for you, is that institutions also determine how much experimentation, how many new things people do, because they determine their incentives and they determine their belief in their ability to explore things in an unhindered fashion. So which sorts of political systems, which sort of economic systems encourage experimentation is one of the most important channels via which institutions matters as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about two things which I call economic losers and political losers. Economic losers is the name that James Robinson and I give to the idea that oftentimes politically powerful groups may oppose either beneficial institutional reforms and or better technologies because they think that they are going to lose out economically. So if you want to understand that as an example, think that you have an economic elite that gains its economic advantage, its profits, its wealth from owning a monopoly. So one reform that economists always favor is, increasing more competition, prices are lower, innovation may be higher, greater efficiency, so monopoly profits are eaten and people benefit. Or we can introduce a new technology that robs the advantage of the monopolists, or a new technology that creates new products. But in all of these cases, if the elite is vested at a point like point C because of their control of those monopolies, then the move to the better frontier, the blue frontier, is going to also come with a move, clockwise move along the frontier and going to B. But compare C to B, you'll see that B has lower income for the rich elite. As a result, they're not going to be favorable to it. So if you want to understand colonial institutions, many of them were very inefficient. Things like encomienda or repartimiento or mita, forced labor, people tied to the land. You could improve incentives, but colonialists had no interest in doing that because that's how they did their extraction. That's how they got their income, their tributes, and so on. So that is the economic losers mechanism. It, in some sense, is emphasizing that the efficiency of an economic allocation and the distribution inequality implications of an economic allocation are inseparable. But James and I thought that even more important than economic losers was what we call political losers. The fact that both institutional changes and new technologies actually destabilize the political power of certain groups. So when you have new technologies introduced, that creates new grievances, political dynamics change. Or if you take away the monopoly power of the rich elite, you're also taking the basis of their political power. So what that implies is that even if you have the instruments to move along the blue frontier after you shift there, those moves are not under the control of the elite. So in particular, you can have a situation in which you shift from point C to the blue frontier, and the rich elite at first can use their political power, even if they lose their monopoly rights, to tax the new activities or to have a big slice of the pie created by the new technologies. But over time, because you've destabilize their political control, there will be forces for a clockwise move from point A towards point B. So ultimately, there will be forces towards point B. And therefore, because point B is worse than point C, again, the elite are going to could have a preference for worse institutions and worse technologies. So you see here the unity of the thinking about institutions and technology. Both inefficient institutions and bad technologies survive to some degree for the same causal channels. But this framework also has within it forces that helps us explain institutional change. So in particular, for instance, in the first book that I wrote with James Robinson, called Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, which itself drew on research that we had done 10 years or so prior to the book, it was about institutional change. For example, how democracy can come about without violence and revolution, but because of the threat of unrest and the threat of revolution. And in terms of this figure, you can have a situation where we start in C, but now, very critically, even though the elite are in control, so they control institutional power, de jure power, every now and then the system is destabilized. For example, people pour into the street because of economic hardship, because of a bad harvest, or because of new machines like the Luddites, and there is a temporary threat of revolution. If the elite does nothing in the face of that threat, they're in danger. So they may try to make concessions. But because de jure power is still in their hands, the concessions, for example, you go from point C to point B, but as soon as that temporary threat of revolution goes, you go back from point B to point C. So that means that these concessions would lack credibility. And if their point was to stave off the unrest, to stave off the threat of revolution, they wouldn't be very effective. How can you overcome that problem? The way you overcome that problem is by voluntarily changing institutions. And in fact, if you look at European history, a lot of democracy didn't arise as a result of a revolution where the existing ruling class was overthrown and executed like in the Bolshevik Russia, but it was in the context of threats that made the elite want to make, or felt compelled to make, institutional concessions. So you see in this framework how certain types of institutional changes are also part of the picture. So now if we apply this framework to the colonial era, it starts already clarifying some of the issues that I talked about. The colonial era was characterized by one thing, first of all, a huge imbalance of power. Europeans came and conquered the 7 corners of the world, and they had overwhelming military power and overwhelming control, especially with the alliances that they made with sometimes with the local elites. That huge imbalance meant that whatever we are, it's going to be an unequal distribution. The native indigenous population is not going to benefit as much, and the colonialists are going to benefit more. But how are they going to do that benefit? At the time, there were 2 factors that made it overwhelmingly likely that it would be through very extractive, very inefficient institutions. One is that in most of the places that they conquered, it wasn't very easy for them to set up a tax system where they would say, you produce most efficiently and then we'll tax the proceeds. Instead, they wanted to grab the land, grab the labor, force the labor to go. So that was the origin of these very inefficient arrangements. They never considered going from those inefficient institutions to more efficient ones because they had no way of getting the same income from the indigenous population. Secondly, colonial authorities were always obsessed with political control, and that's the political losers channel. That means that they approached everything that they thought would change the equilibrium, would destabilize their power and their control, extremely skeptically. So those were the reasons why you had both inefficient institutions and also very much resistance to any type of institutional changes. Now, contrast that to the few places where Europeans settled more, and there, first of all, instead of that huge imbalance, you have a much more balanced distribution of power. Europeans couldn't apply the same violence, the same repression to the European settlers, even when those settlers were from the lower strata of the population. And that balance of power made sure that the most extractive institutions didn't emerge, and that set these countries onto different trajectories. Now, I want to apply this framework to several other episodes. I don't have the time to do it in detail, but I'm going to talk briefly about 2 of them: industrialization and the spread of industrialization throughout Europe, and digital technologies and AI. But to do that, I want to introduce one more theoretical idea, and that's the idea of critical junctures. By critical junctures, was a term that James Robinson and I use extensively in Why Nations Fail, we mean periods in which there are new technologies, demographic shocks, or other unusual changes, such as new opening of trade opportunities, or big shocks, or big wars, where existing institutions are destabilized. And during periods of critical junctures, institutional changes have much wide-reaching implications, and there are more forces towards institutional divergence. So one way you can visualize that, we can start from the two frontiers that I showed you already. The blue one, which you can think of as corresponding to more inclusive institutions as opposed to extractive institutions, and the red dashed one, which would be more extractive institutions. So, for example, the blue one could be more like France or Britain after they have got rid of serfdom, and they have started a very in baby steps the process of democratization, and the red one, the more extractive ones, could be, for example, the Habsburg Empire, where serfdom was still present around the same time, and the absolutist monarchy was still much more powerful. So now, during normal times, there is already a noticeable difference between red and blue. That's what I've been emphasizing. But during critical junctures, potential institutional changes have much bigger effects. So you can imagine that if you have inclusive institutions, you can, for instance, take advantage of new opportunities such as industrial technologies, and that will actually shift your frontier, and the gap between the red and the blue will be much larger. Now I'm showing that as the gap between the red and the green. But as I said, it's not just that inclusive institutions matter more or extractive institutions are worse during critical junctures. During critical junctures, there are destabilizing forces, and different ruling elites are going to take different types of actions. And some of those actions may, for example, intensify repression, intensify control. So as a result, you can actually have worsening institutions. So you can have a situation in which some countries, that were at the brink of a little bit better institutions might reform their institutions and go to green, but some places like Austria-Hungary may actually go to even worse institutions. So that's what we called, for example, path-dependent institutional change. And if you want to understand, for example, industrialization, why industrial technology spread to some places and not others, this sort of critical juncture combined with the framework is actually quite useful. So once industrialization started going underway in Britain, it spread to France and to some other countries quite quickly, but others, such as Russia or the Habsburg Empire, strenuously resisted it. In fact, they didn't want to open any factories. They opposed railways for quite a while, and the argument against this was articulated by one of the top lawmakers in the Habsburg Empire. We do not desire at all that the great masses shall become well off and independent. How could we otherwise rule over them? So that's exactly the political losers channel. You are worried about losing political control and losing all of the privileges that you enjoy as a monarchy or as the nobility as a result of political changes, even if they correspond to better technology and a shift out of the utility technologies possibilities frontier. And the same dynamics also are very important, why you have much bigger divergences in the colonial era between countries such as United States and Mexico. Mexico is a specimen of extractive institutions, United States a specimen of somewhat more inclusive institutions, especially in the Northeast. But in the 17th century, there isn't a big gap between Mexico and the United States. By some measures, Mexico is more prosperous because it has inherited the prosperity of the Aztec Empire. The big gap starts forming sometimes in the beginning of the 19th century, and it's very much related again that Mexico completely turns its back to industrial technology and the United States invests a lot in industrial technology. Now, I want to use this framework to conclude to think about the age of digital technologies. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start with the red line, which is what is a very abstract representation of, say, United States in the 1950s. And I've picked a point on that line, which I called B0, which I'm going to interpret as the beginning of the place in the 1950s and 1960s. In reading this figure, think of the horizontal axis as the manual workers, workers without high qualifications such as a postgraduate degree or often not even a college degree. And on the vertical axis, think of it as capital owners, managers, and very qualified people such as those that become engineers or tech entrepreneurs, etc. So I start with a point like B0 that's quite favorable to the poor because the 1950s and 1960s were a period of rapid growth in the United States, but it was a rapid growth that actually reduced inequality. In the 40s and 50s, for example, real wages for low education workers grew faster than the incomes of managers. And in the 60s and 70s, it was fairly stable. So this was a period of broadly shared prosperity. So then the first thing I'm going to interpret is that we move along the frontier from point B0 to B1. Why would that happen, such a move along the frontier? Well, institutions and the distribution of power becomes more tilted to favor educated workers and managers. So one of the reasons for that was unions started becoming weaker. Another reason for that, large corporations became very strong, and ideologically many people, but most importantly some economists such as Milton Friedman, articulated ideas such as shareholders' values, saying the only thing that responsible managers should do is maximize shareholder values. If they push down wages, that's actually good. So those changes in politics, labor market organization, and the objectives of corporations all started pushing us a little bit in favor of more educated workers and capital owners and managers. at the expense of workers. So that would have been an important change, but it would not have been a revolutionary change in and of itself, in my opinion. What made it a revolutionary change is that around the same time, a new set of technologies also were spreading, and this balance of power determined how those technologies are developed and used. Computers, digital technologies, and all sorts of other advanced technologies. And as a result of this changing politics and the incentives that they created, these technologies were developed in a more automation and skill-biased direction. And that I capture by shifting from the red to the blue frontier. So you'll notice that this shift is a little bit different than the ones that I had considered before, which were up and down. I have tilted it. So this tilt implies that the technological changes have expanded the opportunities for the rich and the educated to get richer, and they have constricted the possibilities for the poor. Because if you, for example, use these technologies to automate a lot of jobs that the poor workers do, then you are going to be at a position that is very difficult to have high wages. So that's the story, and some of my work, especially the work I have done with Pascual Restrepo, as well as by myself, provides empirical evidence and theoretical foundations for this type of shift. Now, this is, in my interpretation, all before the age of AI. This is all taking place, say, up to 2015, 2014. Then AI comes into the scene, especially after 2016. Now, the way that I argue in Power and Progress that Andreas mentioned is that AI should be conceived as a very broad technological platform that you can develop in many different ways. In one way that you can develop AI is an automation technology and an information control technology that's going to be in the hands of the capital owners, the owners of the managers and owners of the largest corporations, and it's going to be used more and more for automation and taking tasks away from low-wage workers. If that happens, we go to a point to a line like C. Sorry, to a line like the green, to a curve like the green one. This green one is even more tilted against labor, and it's favoring capital even more. So if we use AI as a automation and information control technology, the future of inequality is going to be very bleak. Again, this is partly projection, but also partly based on the empirical and theoretical work that I have done. But the other part of the argument is that it is also possible to use AI as an information technology that provides better information, better capabilities for workers so that they can perform more sophisticated tasks, new tasks. They can become more experts because of access to readily available, reliable, context-specific information. If that happens, we can actually go back to a frontier just like the one that in the 50s and the 60s that is more balanced between capital and labor, between educated and uneducated labor. So that's why I've called this pro-worker AI, and this one I've called excessive automation, not just because of its distributional effects, but also if you automate too much, sometimes you automate a lot of the things that workers are pretty good at, and as a result, you see the way I have drawn this, the gains that you get from the green, even for the rich, are not very major. That's the sense in which this might actually correspond to excessive automation. Now, this is an interpretation, and what the framework really, to me, is useful for is that it draws parallels between very disparate episodes, such as how AI is evolving, what are the possibilities, who benefits, who loses, how things are shifted and how we move along the curve versus the industrial era where we're looking at the spread of railways or industrial technology and factories, and the colonial era where we're looking at these foundational institutional choices. So this is very much a summary of the research agenda, and I decided to talk about this because at this such a elite university, I want to encourage other people, including many wonderful economists here, to think more about the political economy of technology and the political economy choices, how they intersect with our current age of AI and the very major consequential issues that are going to determine the divergent trajectories that different societies are going to be on. But in the process, I also use this as an opportunity to summarize some of my work and how different branches of my work have actually merged together in the more recent thing that Andreas mentioned at the beginning. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Many thanks, Daron, for your fascinating overview on the determinants of societal development. My name is Alvis Stutzer. I'm currently serving as Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics, and I have the privilege to start a discussion and then also lead through the Q&A. My first question follows on from your comments on AI at the end of the presentation, and I would like to link it back to politics in these days. So in your latest book, Power and Progress, you advocate stricter regulation of digital technology and digital platforms. Now the US seems to stick to Wild West in its limited regulation. The same holds largely for AI from China, like DeepSeek, I think, as a foundation for DeepSeek. So the question would be, how should Europe react in this situation?
Yeah, so I actually, I'm not like a regulation fanatic. I don't think all regulations are good. There are many sectors in which regulations are counterproductive. But in the AI area, 100%, I agree with the tenor of your question. I think regulations are very important, both because AI is so pervasive, so far-reaching, that its negative consequences could be very dangerous. We have to approach with a sort of trial and error process, and the Wild West wouldn't work there. And also because I think, just like what I indicated at the end of my talk, there are very different futures with AI, and whether we end up with a pro-worker AI or anti-worker AI, we cannot leave that, we shouldn't leave, we can, but we shouldn't leave that decision just to Sam Altman and Elon Musk. So the Wild West has causes. Now, while I agree with you on the US and Wild West, China is, I think, more nuanced. Actually, in China, the government very heavily regulates all digital technologies. So, in some sense, in fact, many technology companies are under the thumb of the Communist Party. Can you imagine in Europe or in the United States, overnight, the government banning people playing video games? So that's the kind of thing that the Chinese government is able to do because of a sort of a very authoritarian control-based system that they have, and they can imprison executives of the CEOs. It's not a good kind of regulation, but it is a kind of regulation. So we have these two polar cases, but they meet in one place. They are both accelerationists, meaning that they want to accelerate AI as fast as possible because both China and the US also see AI as a strategic technology, which means that they believe if they are ahead of the rest in AI, they're going to increase and amplify their geopolitical power. Now, Europe, I think, so far, has had much better instincts in terms of what we want from AI, but not much to show for it. So meaning that I think Europeans have had the right approach to issues of privacy, monopoly, information control, safeguarding AI. And they have also shown that, until now anyway, with Trump it might change, that because European Union is such a big market, when they pass a legislation, large tech companies will have to listen. But it is not effective and it's not tenable for Europe to be the regulator while the US is the innovator. And Europe has fallen very sharply behind in digital tech. I don't believe Europe is behind in every sector. So there are areas from biotech to telecom to aerospace where Europe has shown that it can innovate, but in tech it's very, very behind. So what that means is that for Europe to actually put to practice its better in regulatory instincts, it needs to first develop more expertise in AI and digital technologies, which is a very difficult thing. Draghi report that came out last year was very much emphasizing this, but the devil when it comes to any kind of government action is in the details, and I'm not sure what the details are there in the Draghi report. So that's another area for people to work on.
Thanks a lot. If I may, I would like to change slightly topic and come back to your first part and the role of democracy in our future societies. So I think many people are concerned about the future of democracy, an aspect that is important in your concept of inclusive political institutions. Now, I read in an interview that you gave in December, and you agreed in the interview to the statement that liberal democracies in the Western world lose in support. You said that for several years now, democracy has not really delivered what it promises. You continued and said people want to be heard. Now my question, what would you propose institutionally to further develop democracy in order to tackle this problem of a lack of support?
Well, I did not imply that I knew the answer to that question.
Sure, that was not in the interview, but I thought today we will hear the answer.
But you are 100% right on my views. Democracy is in crisis. It's actually a very dangerous crisis. I'm not definitely saying that it's irreversible, but if you look at every industrialized country, Switzerland a bit of an exception, support for democracy is much lower. Many more people report that they don't trust democratic institutions, that they are willing to have an autocrat or an army rule. And you know who is most disenchanted with democracy? The young. The younger generation have the lowest support for democracy. Equally bad, I think, if you look at views, again, especially among the young, they have become extremely polarized. Very strong left views, very strong right views, and both the left and the right completely refuse compromise. Democracy is about compromise. So if you don't form coalitions, if you don't do some give and take, you cannot make democracy work. But if the young generation both think democracy doesn't work and they completely refuse compromise, I think this is going to be very difficult for democracy. So how did we get here? I think it's by 1,000 cuts, many things. One of them, or many of them, is about the things that democracy did quite well for its time, but hasn't kept up, which is, democracy, I think, had three big promises to people. One is shared prosperity. It's not just a few people, like the landowners of the feudal era, going to be enriched and everybody's going to be left behind. It was about high quality, effective public services, education, roads, healthcare, and it was about voice. People are going to have voice. And I think the feeling among many people, especially in the United States, where I know the data well, is that people feel, rightly to some extent, that all of these three promises, each one of them, we're failing. So in the United States, inequality, as I've indicated, has skyrocketed. There are multi-billionaires, close to trillionaires, while wages for low education workers have actually declined since 1980 in real terms. The quality of public services, which was really the pride of democracies throughout the 20th century, democracies did much better in terms of health, education, public services than autocracies, has been going much worse. All sorts of things have become much more expensive. Services are very low quality and are very unevenly provided. In the United States, healthcare is just a complete disaster. In many countries, in Germany, the public infrastructure is falling to pieces. So there are many aspects in which this quality of high-quality public services have done very badly. And many people feel they don't have a voice. Why is that? Well, I don't know. That's the really hard part. But in the United States, between 80 to 90% people say that politicians don't speak like people like me. And a lot of people say they don't trust institutions, we don't trust Congress, we don't trust courts, we don't trust the president. So there's just a general malaise. I think part of it is that we are going through very difficult times. We are dealing with very difficult issues such as inequality, technology, immigration, globalization. And democracies haven't always listened to the people. People may have very diverse opinions, and some of them are accepted, some of them are shunted aside, and I think that has not worked well for democracies. It's created backlash. Some of it is that faults of democracies have been amplified via social media, sometimes by major media sources, and the polarization, I think, that I've indicated a second ago, is both a cause and a consequence of this democratic failure. But it makes it very difficult to make that democratic failure reverse. Now, if my diagnosis is right, which it may or may not be, if it's right, then the solution is make democracy work better, but also make it work better in a way that the population can recognize. If you make democracy work better, wages increase, quality of public services increases, you create more democratic spaces for people to discuss their issues, even if they are not aligned with those of the educated elites and the party insiders. But then the social media says democracies are horrible and these presidents is doing exactly the opposite, and everybody believe that, then democracy, there's no chance for democracy to actually show that it's working. So how are you going to balance these two things? I don't have the answer to that.
Okay, so I think we open up for a few questions, and the emphasis is on questions. So we do not want to have a refereeing of your work here.
I'm happy for that too.
There are two microphones, two people with microphones in the room. So I saw a hand here, and yeah, and then over here, yeah. So the lady here. And I think there is it's been a question. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I'm really interested to know more about your stance on education, because I know that a lot of your earlier work was done on skill-based technological change and how education can be a mediating factor for that. What would you say in this new kind of era of AI being a big topic and how it can maybe mediate these frontiers or have a big influence on these frontiers? What would you say are some of the challenges or like ideas that you would have for how education could be changed or improved in order to help us move to this more ideal frontier or more equitable frontier?
So thank you very much for that question. Indeed, a lot of the work I did early on was about skill-based technological change, precisely because I was interested in what determines the technology and its effects, and I think skill-based technological change is one of the most interesting applications of that. And I would say that in the age of AI, the natural tendency for people, and it's completely understandable, is to take the future direction of AI as given and say, okay, it's going to eliminate these jobs, it's going to eliminate these skills, and let me find a few things that I can do that are complementary to AI. Perhaps I become a computer programmer, or I do the things that AI is not forecasted to do in the near future. And I think that's completely fine, and some people should do that. But I think as humanity, as a society, we would be impoverished if some skills are completely eliminated. So I think one of the great strengths of human groups is when they have variation in what people do. Some people are great carpenters, some people are great painters, some people are great plumbers. And so therefore what that implies, I'm coming back to the same theme, we shouldn't take the path of AI as given, but also ask how can we make sure that AI doesn't just eliminate all the tasks that certain group of people can do, but how can we make AI work better for painters or better for carpenters, electricians, nurses, educators? And in that way, I think we will create a greater diversity of things. But of course, as an individual, say in college or in high school, you don't have that power. So it is completely understandable that you have to forecast your future and work for your future by taking the direction of AI as given and making your choices according to that.
The question over here.
Thank you for your talk. My question would be, one threat I see to democracy is perceived corruption, that people lose trust in the institutions because people in the institutions misuse, abuse them. And I was wondering, when I saw your graphs, maybe a corruption index to in an analog way, like you did the other thinkings, what you would say to that?
Yeah, so absolutely true. If you look at corruption indices, many of them are very correlated with the rule of law index, because lack of the rule of law leads to corruption. But even more importantly, you're 100% right. So work I have done, for example, shows that if people grow up in democracies, and democracies are clean, they're not corrupt, and they're not leading to major expansions of inequality, they tend to support inequality. But if they see corruption, then their support for democracy dies or declines. And then one of my students has also done this in a much more detailed way in Mexico and Latin America via field experiment, by showing evidence of corruption of politicians, and then tracking sees how people react to that. And in fact, they say they are much less keen on democracy once they see that. So, but perceived. A lot of it is real, but in this age of AI-powered social media, we can also produce a lot of manipulative perception of corruption beyond what is real. So that is going to be another one of those threats.
It works so well with questions that we can go on. Mr. Reichmuth.
There are many challenges, and we see all the problems. But do you see a role model, you know, an ideal, a positive country or institution?
Switzerland.
If so, why?
No, I mean, I don't think this. We've actually talked about this before lunch a little bit. Some people disagree, but I don't think the Swiss model is that easy to export to other countries. But the fact that in Switzerland democracy evolved years and is very participatory, I think the direct ballots are one example of that, but there's a lot of also compromise building, consensus building, I think makes Switzerland actually more immune to some of these trends than other countries. So I think there are lessons there for other nations, although I don't think the lessons are let's introduce referendums right away, because I don't think they would work in the currently polarized environments without other checks and balances. But I think Switzerland is one very interesting case.
And one last question.
So there's a pretty sharp divide in the AI space between the sort of open source models that are freely available on the internet and these closed models that OpenAI and Google have. And we've recently seen from China this new DeepSeek model that's almost as powerful as all of these closed models. How do you see the impact of open source models on the distribution of wealth? Is it good to have these models in the hands of everyone, or is that a bad thing for some reason?
That's a great question, and it's a very, very hotly debated question, and I don't have a very clear answer for you, unfortunately. It is definitely true that if AI tools, especially the most powerful foundation models, become monopolized in the hands of 1, 2, 3 companies, that cannot be good for a democratic control of information, equal opportunities for people, etc. On the other hand, open source models create other problems, making harmful use of these models a little bit harder to monitor. So there is a debate on that, and I see the positives and the negatives, and I'm not sure. But the Meta's model is not really open source in the sense that only some parts of it are available in any case. But I will tell you that the Meta model has been a huge help to academic researchers. Right now, very, very few academics can afford to do anything with large language models, for example, because training them is so expensive, the GPUs are so expensive, and the Meta models is essentially what most people turn to. But I think what the DeepSeek episode highlights to me, actually, is something else. It's the fact that DeepSeek used a very different strategy for pre-training a foundation model that billions of dollars in the United States didn't even consider. So, and they've done it for 1/20th of the cost using reinforcement learning rather than the next word prediction structure that all of the industry has used in the United States. So what that shows is both good news and bad news. The bad news is that it shows how close-minded the most dynamic industry can be, because everybody believes the same thing, everybody is going after the same holy grail in the same way. The good news is that it shows that if you adopt different perspectives, very different things can come out. So if your hope is that with some prodding, some other measures, we can have different direction for AI, that's more pro-worker, that's not as manipulative, that's not as anti-democratic, That's going to come from new firms, new competitors, new architectures, and DeepSeek shows that's actually quite feasible. So that's the good news. Whether we can capitalize on that good news, let's see.
I think on this very good note, and also
the
for
only
Europe,
positive thing here, yes.
also for Europe, this offers new avenues. I think we close this lecture. Thank you again, Daron. So we will, of course, continue this discussion in one form or the other in the future, hopefully together with you.
Thank you.
We started this